This is Chapter 2 of Serendipity Lost, Eden and Its Consequences by Mark Ajita. The first book of the off-course texts. A series of philosophical reflections on the big here and the long now. It staggers the imagination to wonder what the foundational thinkers of our culture would have written if they'd known that humans had lived perfectly well on this planet for millions of years, without agriculture or civilization. If they'd known that agriculture and civilization were not remotely innate to humans. Daniel Quinn, The Story of B, 1996. Chapter 2. Spinoza's Modern Redefinition of Original Sin. Spinoza made more progress in understanding the links between serendipity, human knowledge, and uncertainty than virtually any other European philosopher. Yet he is hardly recognized for this accomplishment. Many critics seem to willfully misunderstand him in order to caricature him as a thinker whose systems strangle reality, when in fact the reverse is true. He subordinated philosophical systems to reality, and his reflections on Eden show this especially well. He sought to tame the painful urge for certainty in making systems that ruined Greek and Christian philosophy. Spinoza's goal was to prevent philosophy from strangling the grand potentials that life really has in store for someone who is truly willing to think. Spinoza seemed to believe, and I think we can agree, that his philosophy was true to the rebellion against certainty-oriented civilizations that motivated the dawn of Judaism. Spinoza recognized Adam's choice in the story of Eden as the marker of a dangerous step towards overly goal-oriented behavior. Of course, the idea of the Neolithic turn was beyond the biological and anthropological knowledge of Spinoza's time, again, the 17th century, almost 2 centuries before Darwin's Origin of Species. Yet Spinoza's philosophical idea of Adam and Eve's fall is that they willfully overestimated their own capabilities to enforce their choices and goals upon the environment. Spinoza made his inroads into the truth of the Eden myth without being concerned at all about the social evolutionary transition to agriculture. For Spinoza, Adam and Eve's fall was due in large part to an error in their understanding of God. Spinoza put it, "The volition and the aversions of God always involve necessity or truth." In other words, what Spinoza was saying is, whatever a truly all-powerful God desires will necessarily then take place. Conversely, everything that takes place in the world can take place only as God desires it. Spinoza continued, "We know, therefore, that God did not say to Adam that God did not wish him to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This would have involved a contradiction, since Adam was obviously able to eat of the tree. If God had wished for Adam not to eat of the tree, then it would have therefore simply been impossible that Adam should have so eaten of the tree. The divine command would have involved an eternal necessity and truth that would have prevented Adam, if God had simply not wanted Adam to choose to eat from the tree." Spinoza was just being logical. God makes the world as he likes. If God really is all-powerful, which he is, by definition, what God wants, God always gets. He's never disappointed. Thus, if God had not wanted Adam to eat from the tree, Adam would not have been able to eat from the tree. But Adam did go on to eat from the tree. And Spinoza explains, "Since Scripture nevertheless narrates that God did give this instruction to Adam, and that nonetheless Adam ate of the tree, we must perforce say that what happened was God revealed to Adam the evil that would almost surely befall Adam if he chose to eat from the tree. But somehow Adam prevented himself from comprehending the nature by which this evil would come to pass. Thus it must have been that Adam failed to understand the revelation as an eternal and necessary truth. Adam misunderstood revelation as a mere command that he could disobey. So according to Spinoza, there was no divine command disobeyed. Adam and Eve's sin was to disregard knowledge given to humans by God, as all true knowledge is. There was no jealous and possessive demand from God in relation to behavior in Eden relative to this tree or any other. God is not an authority. God does not need authority. God is always in immanent control of reality. So then, for Spinoza, what was the nature of Adam's mistake, if it was not a transgression of a prohibition? What was Adam's sin? What did he do wrong, if the sin was not disobedience? Adam and Eve's extremely goal-oriented fixation on their own choices led them to prefer against serendipity. They ignored true knowledge that called their own plans into question. They chose to consider information, facts, as a mere command that could then be ignored or disobeyed. And when you prefer against serendipity, you lose. The insistence that the good equals our own intentions is what trapped Adam and Eve and humanity ever after in a web of illusory forbiddenness. Through their own attempts to achieve their plans, Adam and Eve lost access to unintended good fortune. Spinoza did not use the term serendipity, of course. He never read the private letter that Horace Walpole wrote where he coined the term serendipity. And really at that time, even probability or chance were not very widely understood ideas. But Spinoza did not need that in order to conceptualize the knowledge that Adam ignored. By preferring their own choice to serendipity, ignoring the serendipity imperative, in their own hubris they went about choosing and planning anyway. In Spinoza's revision of Genesis's presentation of the fall of Eden, the fact that the Old Testament says that God told Adam not to eat from the tree was itself merely the flawed reflection in human understanding of potentially negative consequences of intervening in the complex system of his own environment. In fact, the presentation of the Eden story in Genesis, although we can imagine it was not told just this way at first, is characterized by the same delusion as Adam's delusion, the same willful blindness about God and knowledge that is emblematized in the fall of Adam and Eve. Thus, the pattern of Genesis's Eden is a kind of recursive error, the error that the story seems to have been created to show its retelling, also then reenacted. Viewing God as a king who prohibits certain behaviors is just one way of ignoring potentially negative consequences of intervening in the complex system of one's own environment. This was Adam's sin. Adam chose to fixate on his own plans and ignore the negative consequences. Spinoza explains the relationship of Adam's knowledge to Adam's sin. Spinoza says, Adam mistook God's advice, knowledge, for a law, that is, an ordinance followed by a reward or punishment that did not depend necessarily on the nature of the act performed in picking and choosing fruit from this or that tree. Instead, Adam mistook true knowledge as solely the will and power of some kind of king. Adam thought that the revelation in question was a command and a prohibition applied specifically to him. And because of a failure of Adam's own understanding, he reacted to it as one would a law that one does not want to follow. And he acted as though God was, as it were, a lawgiver, a potentate, or a king, an authority, whose wishes could be ignored so long as punishment could be evaded, so long as he could hide from God what he had done. The very idea of forbiddenness helped Adam to ignore what contradicted just what Adam wanted to believe he knew. This was a case of willful ignorance. Nothing had been forbidden, but there was knowledge of a threat of disastrous consequences. More specifically, agriculture fits in this way. Early hominids, the hunter-gatherers, knew how to avoid fixation on their own intentions. However, Adam and Eve were the first humans, the tipping point where that kind of openness to serendipity was lost. The knowledge of threats to agricultural control of the environment felt like a prohibition. Adam and Eve did it, sin, agriculture, partially because they thought it was forbidden. The perception that there was something forbidden, that God was imposing quasi-legal limits on their powers, was part of their sin. They sought to overcome what they wrongly imagined were arbitrary restrictions placed on them. That perception of forbiddenness was incorrect. Spinoza clearly understood that the pervasive error of mankind, or as we now know mankind, post-Neolithic humankind, is an overestimation of mankind's own power to choose and then to avoid unintended consequences of our actions and choices. So, for the error in the way that God's advice was transformed into a command, Spinoza's insight is that those who transmitted the story of Eden infected the fable with their own hubris. Adam misunderstood true knowledge about the potential unintended consequences of his own plans as a prohibition he could avoid. This was a misperception. The retellers of the myth made that error again. They painted God as a potentate, a king in authority. So Adam and Eve's sin, their original sin, was the choice they made, most significantly with regard to managing the growth and propagation of other species. In fact, the trick that Adam played on himself in the original sin of Eden is none other than what humans as a species accomplished in the Neolithic turn towards agriculture. In this choice is contained that sin, which was based in their flawed faith in the certainty of their own plans for the future. This sin is nothing less than the development of agriculture and eventually civilization as we know it. Spinoza's original sin is simply humanity's tendency to exaggerate our own ability to control the world. It is our overconfidence that we can predict the consequences of our own actions with certainty. As we will see, this illusion became writ large in the first great civilizations. Divine rewards and punishment that hinged on the obedience of subordinate subjects to leadership centered society on an illusion of certainty. This is the idea of certainty-oriented civilizations that we will discuss more in the next chapter or two. Spinoza's work attempted a demystification of the roots of Judeo-Christianity in an age where economic growth in Europe was already causing fractures in traditional church power in a way that would be devastating. Spinoza's publications that circulated throughout Europe from his home in Amsterdam actually became synonymous with atheism. Even more amazingly, Spinoza's detractors in Europe branded him as Europe's new Muhammad and its new Confucius. Born into a family expelled from Spain during the Catholic Inquisition in the early 17th century, Spinoza was fortunate enough to have settled in one of the most culturally advanced and most nearly capitalist societies in the world, the Dutch Republic. However, Spinoza was expelled from his synagogue as a young man. Not long after that, this brilliant young man's reputation as a philosopher, with little regard for contemporary religious authorities, led to his being decried as the worst heretic in Christian history. Spinoza broke entirely with Augustine's ideas and the traditional church, and really the lens through which he made his major breaks was his reading of the myth of Eden. Spinoza's contemporary Thomas Hobbes, and then a century later Jean-Jacques Rousseau, were the thinkers in the modern West who most famously described the state of culture as the superior and opposite condition only achieved by humans who had ascended from a brutal state of nature, where humans were constantly in a war of all against all. Compared to the nature-cultural dichotomy, even with the different values that Hobbes and Rousseau gave to this opposition, Spinoza's seemingly creationist account was actually more insightful. Spinoza's ideas of Eden, sin, and God fall outside the framework of modern scientific knowledge about evolution. Still, the ideas in this interpretation of Eden were inimical to the religious economics of the 17th century church. If Adam's sin was not disobedience, then disobedience to clerical authorities in 17th century Europe, Catholic, Jewish, or Protestant, would then be precious little indication of sin. Of course, the churches of Spinoza's time owed their existence to an entitlement to act as God's representative among kings on earth. Hence, the ideas in Spinoza's theological political treatise about Eden were among the most scandalous Western culture has ever known. In fact, some people today may find them to be no less scandalous than did Europe of the 17th century. There is much more in Spinoza's thought of Eden than a mere attack on clerics and pastors among Spinoza's contemporaries. Some have argued that the ideas Spinoza used in his reading of the Eden myth were the spark that ignited the European Enlightenment. It is not an exaggeration to say that the way Spinoza re-envisioned the meaning of the myth of Eden at the dawn of the Enlightenment changed literate Europe forever. The intellectual legacies of this Spinozist shift are manifold. Arguments for democracy and arguments for capitalism all expand out from the modern revolutionary break from religious tradition, initiated or perhaps revived by Spinoza. Well, Adam and Eve imagined that they were capable of knowing more than they could know. Agricultural Adam chose his delusion that he could have certain knowledge and control over the future. Hunter-gatherers before him knew that you just could never have that. But to act in this way, Adam had to put aside certain lingering and justified doubts about his process of planning. You could say that this willful ignorance of reality was the beginning of the human experiment with sin, which would become the pervasive belief in divine authorities, dependent on the certain belief of followers. Plans made kings divine, and the religion that surrounded them made possible the growth of civilizations of certainty that we will describe in the next 2 chapters. This has been Spinoza's modern redefinition of original sin, Chapter 2 of Serendipity Lost, Eden and its Consequences. Up next, Chapter 3, From Farming to States.